In the early months of 1940, France stood as one of Europe's most powerful nations, confident in its army, its alliances, and the defensive strength of the Maginot Line. To many, the memory of the First World War still shaped expectations, a slow, grinding conflict fought along fortified lines. But the war that came was something entirely different. When German forces launched their offensive in May, they bypassed heavily defended positions and advanced through the Ardennes, a region long considered unsuitable for a large-scale assault. It was a bold and unexpected move that shattered long-held assumptions within days. What followed was not a conventional campaign, but a rapid and coordinated advance that left little time to react. Armored divisions pushed forward with remarkable speed, supported by air power that disrupted communications and weakened resistance before it could fully form. French units, often isolated and lacking clear orders, struggled to reorganize under constant pressure. Entire formations were forced into retreat, not because they lacked courage, but because the structure around them was collapsing. The war had changed, and France had been caught unprepared for its new reality. Beyond the battlefield, the consequences were immediate and deeply human. As news of the advancing forces spread, millions of civilians began to flee their homes. Roads leading south became crowded with families carrying their belongings, moving alongside retreating soldiers and abandoned vehicles. The sense of order that once defined the country gave way to confusion and uncertainty. Cities emptied, and the atmosphere was filled with a quiet but growing realization that something irreversible was unfolding. In Paris, the government faced a crisis that was both military and existential. Officials debated whether to continue the fight or seek an armistice to prevent further devastation. Some believed that resistance could still be organized, possibly from overseas territories. Others saw surrender as the only way to preserve what remained of the nation. These decisions were made under immense pressure, with each passing day narrowing the available options. Amid this uncertainty stood Brigadier General Charles de Gaulle. Unlike many senior commanders, he had long argued for a modern, mobile approach to warfare centered on speed and coordination. Now, as events unfolded exactly along those lines, his warnings appeared almost prophetic. Yet his influence remained limited, and the collapse was happening too quickly to reverse. For de Gaulle, the fall of France was not simply a military defeat, it was a test of national identity. While others began to accept the idea that the war was lost, he believed that France could still fight on. The nation, in his view, was more than its territory. It was an idea that could survive occupation and return stronger. And in those final days before the fall, as the future of France hung in the balance, de Gaulle began to consider a path that few others were willing to take. By mid-June 1940, the situation in France had deteriorated beyond recovery. German forces were closing in on Paris, and the French government, overwhelmed and divided, began to prepare for an armistice. The sense of inevitability hung over every decision. For many officials, the priority was no longer victory, but survival, preserving what remained of the nation by ending the fighting. Yet for Charles de Gaulle, this moment demanded a different response. To accept defeat, he believed, was to accept the disappearance of France as a free and independent power. On June 16th, as political leaders moved closer to surrender, de Gaulle made a decisive and deeply personal choice. Refusing to be part of a government that would negotiate with the enemy, he resolved to continue the struggle from abroad. The following day, with little ceremony and no guarantee of success, he left France for Britain. His departure was not the escape of a defeated man, but the beginning of a new form of resistance, one that would exist beyond borders and occupation. Arriving in London, de Gaulle entered an uncertain world. He held no official authority, commanded no army, and represented a nation that was on the verge of capitulation. Yet he carried with him a powerful conviction that France still had a role to play in the war. In British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, he found a cautious but crucial ally. Churchill understood that even a symbolic continuation of French resistance could have immense strategic and psychological value. Though their relationship would often be complex, in this moment, their interests aligned. On June 18, 1940, de Gaulle was given access to the airwaves of the BBC. From a small studio in London, he delivered a message that would echo far beyond its immediate audience. Speaking to the French people, he urged them not to lose hope, not to accept defeat as final. He argued that this war was global, that the resources of the wider world, including the British Empire and industrial power across the Atlantic, would ultimately turn the tide. France, he insisted, was not alone. The broadcast itself was heard by relatively few at the time, but its significance would grow in the months and years that followed. It became a symbol of defiance, a declaration that France had not surrendered, only its government had. In that moment, de Gaulle transformed himself from an obscure general into the voice of free France. His position remained fragile. Many within France did not yet know his name, and others questioned his legitimacy. But the idea he represented began to take hold, that resistance was still possible, and that the fight for France's future had entered a new phase. From exile, with nothing but conviction and a voice carried over radio waves, Charles de Gaulle began to build a movement that would challenge both occupation and despair. In the weeks following his arrival in London, Charles de Gaulle faced a daunting reality. His appeal of June 18th had planted a seed, but a single broadcast could not build a movement. France was now divided. Its government had signed an armistice, and a new regime had begun to take shape, one that claimed legitimacy while operating under the shadow of occupation. For millions of French citizens, uncertainty replaced clarity. Who truly represented France? The authorities within its borders, or the lone general speaking from exile? De Gaulle understood that words alone would not be enough. If his vision of a continued struggle was to survive, it needed structure, recognition, and above all, people willing to believe in it. From modest offices in London, he began the slow and difficult process of organizing what would become the Free French Forces. At first, their numbers were small: soldiers, sailors, and airmen who had managed to escape or who refused to accept the new order at home. Many arrived with little more than the clothes they wore, driven by a quiet determination to continue the fight. Convincing others to join was not easy. Communication with occupied France was limited, and the risks of open resistance were severe. Yet de Gaulle's message began to spread, carried through whispers, letters, and broadcasts. It spoke not only of military resistance, but of dignity and identity. He did not promise quick victory. Instead, he offered something more enduring: the idea that France's defeat was temporary and that its future was still being written. At the same time, de Gaulle had to navigate a complex international landscape. While Britain supported him, recognition from other Allied powers was far from guaranteed. Some leaders viewed him as a useful figurehead. Others saw him as a challenge to established authority. De Gaulle, however, was determined to maintain independence. He insisted that Free France was not merely an extension of British policy, but a sovereign force in its own right. This insistence would lead to tensions, but it also defined the character of his movement. Within occupied France, small groups began to organize quietly. Acts of resistance, however limited at first, became symbols of defiance. Intelligence networks formed, messages were passed, and the idea of liberation slowly took root. Though these efforts were scattered and often isolated, they were connected by a shared belief that France had not truly surrendered. For de Gaulle, each new volunteer, each act of resistance was proof that his vision was not in vain. From exile, he was no longer just speaking for France. He was helping to reshape its future. The voice that once echoed alone across the airwaves was beginning to find an answer. carried back through the silence of an occupied nation. By late 1940, Charles de Gaulle found himself in a unique and uncertain position. He claimed to represent France, yet he stood far from its borders. The government in Vichy, led by Marshal Pétain, asserted its authority within the country, while de Gaulle operated from London with limited resources and fragile support. The question of legitimacy became central, not only in the eyes of the world, but among the French themselves. Who was the true voice of France in this moment of crisis? De Gaulle's answer was clear. Legitimacy did not come from control of territory, but from the refusal to surrender. In his view, the armistice had compromised the independence of France, placing it under conditions that stripped it of real sovereignty. By continuing the fight, even from exile, he believed he preserved the true continuity of the French state. It was a bold and controversial claim, one that many initially rejected. Yet it became the foundation upon which free France would grow. To transform this idea into reality, de Gaulle needed more than speeches. He needed territory, forces, and recognition. His attention turned to the French colonies overseas. These distant regions, scattered across Africa and beyond, suddenly became crucial to the future of the war. If they could be brought under the banner of Free France, they would provide not only manpower and resources, but also a tangible presence on the global stage. The process was far from straightforward. Some colonial administrators remained loyal to Vichy, uncertain or unwilling to shift allegiance. Others saw in de Gaulle an opportunity to continue the fight and align with the Allies. Through negotiation, persuasion, and sometimes quiet pressure, territories such as French Equatorial Africa began to declare support for Free France. Each new territory was more than a strategic gain. It was a symbolic victory, proof that de Gaulle's movement was no longer just an idea, but a growing reality. At the same time, de Gaulle faced challenges within his own ranks. The Free French forces were diverse, composed of individuals from different backgrounds, experiences, and motivations. Maintaining unity among them required not only leadership, but a clear sense of purpose. De Gaulle's style, firm, uncompromising, and deeply focused on France's independence, sometimes created tension, yet it also provided direction in a time of uncertainty. Internationally, his position remained delicate. While Britain continued to support him, other Allied powers hesitated to grant full recognition. De Gaulle, however, refused to be sidelined. He believed that France's role in the war must be preserved, not as a secondary participant, but as a nation determined to reclaim its place among the victors. In these months, without a homeland under his control, de Gaulle began to build something remarkable, a nation in exile. It was a fragile creation, held together by conviction rather than territory. But with each passing day, as more people and regions joined his cause, that fragile structure grew stronger. The idea of Free France was no longer just a voice on the radio. It was becoming a force that could shape the outcome of the war. As 1941 unfolded, Charles de Gaulle faced a battle unlike any fought on the front lines. It was a struggle not of weapons, but of recognition, political, diplomatic, and symbolic. While Free France was slowly growing in strength, its legitimacy on the international stage remained uncertain. Many Allied leaders still viewed de Gaulle as a self-appointed figure, a man with ambition but limited authority. To them, the official government of France, despite its compromised position, still existed elsewhere. For de Gaulle, this ambiguity was dangerous. Without recognition, Free France risked being sidelined in decisions that would shape the future of Europe. Determined to change this, de Gaulle worked tirelessly to present his movement as a true continuation of France. He emphasized that Free France was not a rebellion, but a continuation of lawful resistance against occupation. His speeches became sharper, more confident, reinforcing the idea that France had not ceased to exist. It had simply moved beyond its borders. Every declaration, Every meeting, every negotiation was part of a larger effort to secure a place at the table among the Allies. Yet this path was filled with tension. His relationship with Winston Churchill, though rooted in mutual necessity, was often strained. Churchill admired de Gaulle's determination but found him difficult to manage. De Gaulle, for his part, resisted any attempt to subordinate Free France to British interests. He insisted on independence in decision-making, even when resources and support came largely from Britain. This insistence created friction, but it also defined the identity of his movement. Free France would not be a tool, it would be a partner. Beyond Britain, de Gaulle sought broader support. He looked to the United States, understanding that American involvement would be crucial to the outcome of the war. However, American leaders were cautious. They questioned de Gaulle's authority and were reluctant to fully commit to his cause. For de Gaulle, this hesitation was both a challenge and an opportunity. It forced him to strengthen his position, to demonstrate through action that Free France was a force capable of contributing meaningfully to the Allied effort. Meanwhile, the territories that had joined Free France began to play a more active role. From Africa and beyond, troops were organized, trained, and prepared for operations alongside Allied forces. These developments provided tangible proof that de Gaulle's movement was not merely symbolic. It had substance, manpower, and purpose. Within occupied France, the idea of resistance continued to grow. Though still fragmented, networks began to form, inspired in part by the broadcast from London. De Gaulle's voice, once distant and uncertain, was becoming a steady presence, one that reminded the French people that their country's story was not yet finished. The struggle for recognition was far from over, but progress was undeniable. With each passing month, Free France moved closer to being acknowledged not just as a symbol of defiance, but as a legitimate force in the global conflict. And at the center of it all stood Charles de Gaulle, unyielding, determined, and increasingly impossible to ignore. By 1942, the idea of resistance in France had begun to evolve from scattered acts of defiance into a more coordinated and determined effort. What had once been isolated groups operating in secrecy slowly started to form networks with shared goals and growing confidence. Across cities, villages, and rural landscapes, individuals who had never imagined themselves as part of a struggle now found themselves drawn into a movement that sought to reclaim the nation's future. These early resistance groups were diverse in both composition and purpose. Some focused on gathering intelligence, tracking movements, observing infrastructure, and passing vital information to the Allies. Others worked to disrupt communication lines, slow transport systems, or spread underground publications that challenged the narrative imposed by occupation authorities. Each act, no matter how small, carried risk. The consequences of discovery were severe, yet the willingness to continue revealed a deep and quiet resolve among those involved. From London, Charles de Gaulle recognized the importance of these growing efforts. However, he also understood a critical challenge. The resistance within France was fragmented. Different groups operated independently, often without coordination or a unified command. If these efforts were to have a meaningful impact on the course of the war, they needed to be brought together under a common direction. To achieve this, de Gaulle worked to establish connections with leaders inside France. Communication was difficult and dangerous, relying on coded messages, couriers, and radio transmissions that could be intercepted. Despite these obstacles, links were gradually formed. The goal was not to control every action, but to provide structure, aligning the efforts of the resistance with the broader strategy of the Allies. At the same time, the Free French forces continued to grow beyond Europe. In North Africa and other regions, troops gathered under the banner of Free France began to take part in military operations. These forces were no longer symbolic. They were actively contributing to the Allied war effort. Their presence reinforced de Gaulle's claim that France remained a fighting nation. Yet challenges persisted. Differences in ideology, strategy, and leadership created tension both within the resistance and between de Gaulle and other Allied leaders. Balancing these relationships required careful navigation. De Gaulle remained firm in his belief that France must emerge from the war not as a subordinate, but as a sovereign power. Within occupied France, the sense of isolation slowly gave way to cautious hope. Acts of resistance, once rare and disconnected, began to feel part of something larger. The idea that liberation was possible, though still distant, started to take root. It was not yet a unified movement, but it was growing, strengthening, and learning to endure. For de Gaulle, this phase marked a turning point. The struggle was no longer just about proving that France still existed. It was about preparing for the moment when it would rise again. By 1943, the resistance within France had grown in both size and confidence, but it remained divided. Numerous groups operated across the country, each with its own leadership, ideology, and methods. While all opposed occupation, their lack of coordination limited their effectiveness. For Charles de Gaulle, this fragmentation posed a serious problem. If France was to play a meaningful role in its own liberation, the resistance needed to become more than a collection of isolated efforts. It needed unity. To achieve this, de Gaulle turned to one of the most important figures of the internal resistance, Jean Moulin. Tasked with an almost impossible mission, Moulin was sent into occupied France to bring together various factions under a single structure. It required not only courage, but diplomacy, patience, and the ability to bridge deep political differences. Some groups were driven by nationalism, others by broader ideological visions, yet all had to find common ground. Working in secrecy and under constant threat, Moulin traveled across France, meeting leaders, negotiating alliances, and building trust. Slowly, his efforts began to take shape. In May 1943, these fragmented groups were brought together into the National Council of the Resistance, a unified body that coordinated activities and aligned them with the broader goals of Free France and the Allies. It was a major breakthrough, transforming resistance from scattered defiance into an organized force. For de Gaulle, this achievement was more than strategic, it was symbolic. It demonstrated that France was not merely waiting to be liberated by others, but was actively participating in its own future. The resistance, now more cohesive, could support Allied operations with greater efficiency, providing intelligence, disrupting infrastructure, and preparing for the eventual return of large-scale military operations on French soil. Yet unity did not eliminate danger. The work of the resistance remained highly risky. Networks were constantly under threat of exposure, and maintaining secrecy required discipline and sacrifice. The capture of key figures could have devastating consequences, and the pressure on those involved was immense. Still, the movement endured, strengthened by its shared purpose. At the same time, de Gaulle continued to assert his authority on the international stage. With the resistance now more clearly aligned with Free France, his position gained credibility. He was no longer speaking for an abstract idea. He was connected to a growing network within France itself. The unification of the resistance marked a turning point in the war's hidden front. What had begun as isolated acts of defiance had evolved into a coordinated effort capable of influencing the course of events. And behind it all stood a vision, one that insisted France would not only be freed, but would rise again with its identity intact. By 1944, the war had entered a decisive phase. Across Europe, the balance of power was shifting, and plans were being prepared for a massive return to the continent. For Charles de Gaulle and the forces of Free France, this moment carried immense significance. The question was no longer whether France would be liberated, but how and by whom. De Gaulle was determined that France would not simply be freed by others. It would stand as an active participant in its own liberation. Preparations intensified as Allied planners finalized the details of a large-scale invasion. The operation would require coordination on an unprecedented level, land, sea, and air forces working together to establish a foothold in Western Europe. Within France, the resistance was given new directives: disrupt transportation networks, gather intelligence, and prepare to support the incoming forces. These actions were not random acts of defiance, but carefully timed efforts designed to weaken the occupying system from within. For de Gaulle, this was also a political battle. He understood that liberation would shape the future of France's government and its place in the post-war world. If Free France did not play a visible role, there was a risk that decisions about the country's future could be made without its voice. He pressed the Allies to recognize French participation, insisting that French forces must be present not only as symbols, but as contributors on the ground. Within the resistance, anticipation grew alongside tension. Years of secrecy and survival were giving way to the possibility of open action. Networks that had operated in shadows now prepared to emerge into the light, ready to assist in the final stages of the struggle. Messages were transmitted, plans refined, and expectations carefully managed. The moment of change was approaching, but it would demand precision and patience. As Allied forces prepared to cross the Channel, the atmosphere in France was charged with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. Liberation promised an end to occupation, but it also raised questions about the future, about leadership, reconstruction, and the path forward. For many, the coming events felt like the culmination of years of endurance. For de Gaulle, this was the moment he had been preparing for since his first broadcast in 1940. From exile, with no army and no territory, he had built a movement that now stood on the threshold of returning home. The challenge ahead was immense, but so was the opportunity. France was about to re-enter the stage, not as a defeated nation, but as one determined to reclaim its place in history. In the summer of 1944, the long-awaited moment finally arrived. Allied forces had established a foothold in Western Europe, and the liberation of France was no longer a distant hope. It was unfolding in real time. For Charles de Gaulle, this was more than a military turning point. It was the beginning of France's return, not just territorially, but politically and symbolically. As operations expanded inland, the French resistance played a crucial role. Networks that had operated in secrecy for years now acted openly, guiding Allied units, disrupting retreating forces, and helping to secure key locations. Their actions demonstrated that France had not been passive during occupation. It had endured, organized, and waited for the moment to rise. Amid this rapidly changing landscape, de Gaulle prepared to return to French soil. His arrival carried immense significance. He was not returning as a commander of a large army, nor as the head of a government recognized by all. Yet he embodied something powerful, the continuity of a France that had refused to disappear. When he stepped onto liberated ground, it marked the transition from exile to presence, from voice to action. One of the most defining moments came with his entry into Paris. The city, long a symbol of culture and identity, had endured years under occupation. Now, as liberation forces approached, its streets became the stage for a historic transformation. De Gaulle walked through Paris not with spectacle, but with quiet authority. Crowds gathered, their reactions reflecting a mixture of relief, emotion, and cautious optimism. For many, his presence signaled that France was reclaiming itself. Yet beneath the surface of celebration lay complexity. The transition from occupation to liberation required immediate decisions about governance, security, and order. De Gaulle moved quickly to establish authority, ensuring that France would not fall into uncertainty or external control. His goal was clear: France must govern itself, even in the immediate aftermath of liberation. At the same time, tensions remained among Allied leaders. Questions of political structure, influence, and recognition did not disappear with military success. De Gaulle continued to assert that France's future must be determined by the French people, not shaped solely by external powers. His firm stance reinforced his position, even as it created moments of friction. The return to France marked the culmination of years of persistence. What had begun as a solitary voice in London had become a movement capable of shaping events on the ground. For de Gaulle, it was a moment of validation, but also the beginning of a new challenge. Liberation was not the end of the journey. It was the start of rebuilding a nation that had been tested to its core. As France emerged from occupation, liberation quickly gave way to a new and complex reality. The country had regained its freedom, but it faced the immense task of rebuilding itself, politically, economically, and socially. Years of war had left deep scars. Infrastructure was damaged, institutions weakened, and trust within society had been strained. For Charles de Gaulle, the challenge was clear. France must not only recover, but reassert itself as a strong, independent nation. One of his first priorities was to establish a stable government. The provisional authority that he led needed to demonstrate legitimacy and control, both to the French people and to the Allied powers. This meant restoring order in a country where systems had been disrupted and where uncertainty still lingered. Administrative structures had to be rebuilt, services restored, and a sense of normal life gradually reintroduced. At the same time, de Gaulle was determined to ensure that France would not be treated as a defeated nation in the post-war settlement. Despite the years of occupation, he insisted that France had remained part of the Allied cause through the efforts of Free France and the resistance. This position was not universally accepted at first, but de Gaulle's persistence played a key role in securing France's place among the nations shaping the future of Europe. Internally, the situation required careful balance. The liberation had brought together people from different backgrounds, those who had resisted, those who had endured, and those who had navigated the complexities of life under occupation. Rebuilding unity required more than political decisions. It required a shared sense of purpose. De Gaulle emphasized continuity, presenting France not as a nation that had been broken, but as one that had endured and was now reclaiming its path. Economic recovery posed another major challenge. Production had been disrupted, resources were limited, and rebuilding required coordination on a national scale. Efforts were made to restore industry, infrastructure, and transportation networks, laying the groundwork for long-term stability. These steps were essential not only for recovery, but for restoring confidence among the population. On the international stage, France began to reassert its presence. De Gaulle sought to ensure that the country would play a meaningful role in shaping the post-war order. His vision extended beyond immediate recovery. He aimed to position France as a key actor in a changing world, one that would be defined by new alliances, emerging tensions, and the lessons of recent history. The process of rebuilding was not immediate, nor was it without difficulty, but it marked a critical transition from survival to renewal. For de Gaulle, this phase was the fulfillment of what he had envisioned during the darkest days of 1940. France had not only been liberated, it was beginning to stand again, determined to define its own future. By the final stages of the war, as Allied forces advanced deeper into Europe, the question of the post-war order began to take shape. Nations were already looking beyond victory, considering how the world would be rebuilt and who would shape its future. For Charles de Gaulle, this was a decisive moment, not only for France, but for its status on the global stage. After years of occupation, exile, and resistance, he was determined that France would not be treated as a secondary power. Despite initial hesitation from some Allied leaders, de Gaulle pressed firmly for recognition. He argued that France, through the efforts of Free French forces and the resistance, had remained part of the fight from beginning to end. This claim was more than symbolic. It was a strategic necessity. Without recognition, France risked being excluded from key decisions that would define the political landscape of Europe. Gradually, his efforts began to yield results. France was acknowledged as one of the Allied powers, and its role in the liberation of Western Europe strengthened its position. French forces participated in operations that contributed to the final stages of the war, reinforcing the image of a nation that had returned not only to its territory, but to active involvement in global events. One of the most significant outcomes of this recognition was France's inclusion among the nations that would shape post-war security structures. As discussions began on the formation of new international institutions, France secured a place at the table. This was a critical achievement for de Gaulle, ensuring that the country would have a voice in decisions affecting the future of Europe and beyond. At home, this recognition reinforced national pride. The narrative of France as a defeated nation was replaced by one of endurance and contribution. The efforts of the resistance, combined with the actions of Free France, became central to this identity. It was a powerful shift, one that helped unify the country during a time of transition. Yet de Gaulle remained cautious. He understood that recognition did not guarantee influence. Maintaining France's position would require continued strength, both internally and externally. The war had reshaped global power dynamics, and the emerging world would be defined by new challenges and alliances. For de Gaulle, securing France's place among the victors was not the end of his mission. It was a foundation. It ensured that the sacrifices made during the wars would translate into a meaningful role in the peace that followed. France had returned, not as a nation defined by its defeat, but as one determined to shape its future on its own terms. As the war in Europe drew to a close, France stood at a critical crossroads. The country had been liberated, its authority restored, and its place among the Allied powers secured. But beneath this apparent stability lay growing political tension. The question was no longer simply how to rebuild France, but how it should be governed in the future. For Charles de Gaulle, this issue was fundamental. He believed that France needed a strong, unified state, one capable of preventing the divisions and instability that had weakened it before the war. Leading the provisional government, de Gaulle sought to establish order while laying the foundation for a new political system. His vision emphasized authority, continuity, and national unity. He believed that leadership must be decisive, guided by long-term national interests rather than short-term political compromise. This perspective, however, did not align with all factions within France. Political groups, newly re-emerging after years of suppression, brought with them different ideas about democracy, representation, and the balance of power. Debates intensified as the future structure of government became a central issue. Some favored a parliamentary system with strong legislative influence, while others supported a more centralized model. De Gaulle grew increasingly frustrated with what he saw as fragmentation, parties prioritizing their own agendas over the unity of the nation. In his view, France risked repeating the same patterns that had contributed to its earlier vulnerability. These tensions were not merely theoretical. They affected real decisions about governance, policy, and the direction of the country. De Gaulle found himself navigating a complex political landscape, where compromise was often necessary, but not always desirable. His leadership style, firm, principled, and resistant to dilution, both strengthened his authority and deepened divisions with certain political groups. At the same time, France faced ongoing challenges of reconstruction. Infrastructure needed to be restored, institutions strengthened, and public confidence rebuilt. These tasks required cooperation, yet political disagreements made consensus difficult. The balance between immediate needs and long-term vision became increasingly delicate. For de Gaulle, the stakes were clear. He had fought to ensure that France would emerge from the war as a sovereign and respected nation. Now, he faced the challenge of shaping its internal structure in a way that would preserve that status. But as debates grew more intense, it became evident that his vision would not be easily realized within the existing political framework. The end of the war had brought victory, but it had also opened a new chapter of uncertainty. France was free, but its future remained undecided. And for Charles de Gaulle, the next decision would be one of the most defining of his entire career. By early 1946, the tensions within France's political landscape had reached a breaking point. The unity that had been forged during the struggle for liberation was beginning to fracture under the pressures of governance. Political parties, once suppressed or operating in secrecy, had reemerged with their own agendas, priorities, and visions for the future. For Charles de Gaulle, this environment felt increasingly at odds with the principles he believed were necessary to secure France's stability. He had envisioned a system where leadership could act decisively, where the state would be strong enough to prevent the kind of paralysis that had contributed to France's collapse in 1940. Yet the direction being taken pointed toward a more fragmented structure, with power distributed across competing political forces. Debates became prolonged, decisions delayed, and compromise often came at the cost of clarity. To de Gaulle, it seemed that the lessons of the past were at risk of being overlooked. Faced with this reality, he made a decision that surprised many. Rather than remain within a system he did not fully support, he chose to step away. In January 1946, Charles de Gaulle resigned from his position as head of the provisional government. It was not an act of retreat, but a statement, an expression of his unwillingness to lead in a way that conflicted with his vision for France. His departure marked the end of one phase of his leadership, but not the end of his influence. Though no longer in office, he remained a central figure in French public life. His ideas, his wartime role, and his presence continued to shape political discourse. For many, he was still the embodiment of resistance and national continuity. For others, he represented a more rigid approach to governance that did not align with emerging democratic structures. Across France, reactions were mixed. Some viewed his resignation with concern, seeing it as the loss of a strong and unifying leader. Others saw it as a necessary step toward a more balanced political system. Regardless of perspective, the impact of his decision was undeniable. It signaled that the post-war era would not simply be a continuation of wartime unity. It would be defined by debate, negotiation, and the search for a new identity. For de Gaulle himself, stepping away was part of a longer journey. He had helped guide France through one of the most challenging periods in its history. Now, he chose to wait, confident that his role in shaping the nation's future was not yet complete. The war had tested France's endurance. The peace would test its direction. And in that unfolding story, Charles de Gaulle remained a figure whose influence extended far beyond the office he had just left. In the years immediately following his resignation, Charles de Gaulle remained a powerful presence in the French imagination. Though no longer holding office, his role during the war had already secured his place in history. He was remembered as the man who refused to accept defeat, who spoke when others were silent, and who carried the idea of France beyond its borders when its future seemed uncertain. His leadership of Free France had transformed not only the course of the war for his country, but also the way the nation understood itself. The legacy of Free France extended far beyond military contribution. It reshaped the narrative of the war within France. Instead of being defined solely by occupation and surrender, the story now included resistance, continuity, and determination. The efforts of those who had joined de Gaulle, from soldiers and pilots to members of the underground, became part of a broader identity rooted in endurance and resilience. It was a shift that carried deep emotional and cultural significance. Internationally, De Gaulle's actions ensured that France retained its voice in the post-war world. By maintaining a presence throughout the conflict, he prevented the country from being excluded from decisions that would shape the future of Europe. France emerged not as a passive observer, but as a participant, one that had endured hardship and contributed to the outcome. This position would influence its role in alliances, diplomacy, and the rebuilding of a continent in transition. Yet de Gaulle's legacy was not without complexity. His strong leadership style, his insistence on independence, and his resistance to compromise left a lasting imprint on French politics. Some admired his clarity and determination. Others saw his approach as rigid and difficult to reconcile with evolving democratic structures. These differing perspectives became part of the broader conversation about France's identity in the modern world. Within the country, the memory of the war continued to shape public consciousness. Monuments, commemorations, and personal stories kept the experience alive, reminding future generations of the cost of conflict and the importance of unity. De Gaulle's role within that memory remained central, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of what it meant to stand firm in the face of uncertainty. Though he had stepped away from power, his influence endured. The ideas he championed, sovereignty, national pride, and the importance of independent decision-making, continued to resonate. France was rebuilding, redefining itself in a rapidly changing world, but the foundations laid during the war remained strong. The story of Free France was not only about survival, it was about identity, about how a nation sees itself after being tested. And in that story, Charles de Gaulle stood as a figure who had helped preserve not just a country, but the idea of what it could become. By the end of the Second World War, Charles de Gaulle had become far more than a military figure or political leader. He had come to represent something deeper, an enduring symbol of national will. At a time when France faced collapse, uncertainty, and occupation, he chose a path that few were willing to take. From exile without an army or formal authority, he held on to a single conviction: that France had not ceased to exist and that its future was still within reach. His journey was not defined by immediate success. In the early days, his voice reached only a small audience. His position was questioned, his authority challenged, and his path uncertain. Yet he persisted, guided not by circumstances, but by belief. Over time, that belief began to resonate, first among a handful of volunteers, then within resistance networks, and eventually across an entire nation. What began as a solitary act of defiance became a movement that contributed to the liberation of France. De Gaulle's leadership was marked by a strong sense of independence. He refused to allow France to be seen as a nation defined solely by its defeat. Instead, he insisted that its identity was shaped by those who continued to fight, who resisted, and who believed in its future. This perspective helped reshape how France emerged from the war, not as a country that had simply been freed, but as one that had played a role in its own liberation. Yet his legacy extends beyond the events of the war itself. The choices he made during those critical years influenced the direction of France in the decades that followed. His vision of a strong, sovereign nation continued to shape political thought, guiding discussions about leadership, governance, and the country's place in the world. Even outside of office, his presence remained a reference point, a reminder of what determination and conviction can achieve. For those who lived through the war, his story was one of resilience. For later generations, it became a lesson in leadership under pressure. He demonstrated that even in moments of profound uncertainty, the course of history can be influenced by individuals willing to stand apart from the prevailing tide. In the end, Charles de Gaulle did not simply lead France through one of its darkest periods. He helped redefine what it meant to endure. His legacy is not only found in the victories that followed, but in the refusal to accept that defeat was final. And in that refusal, he ensured that France would rise again, not just as a nation restored, but as one that had rediscovered its purpose.